The sound of the blow shattered the silence of the diner like a gunshot. A woman's body recoiled from the impact, stumbling until she hit the jagged edge of the counter. Coffee spilled across the floor in a dark, spreading stain. Blood trickled from the corner of her split lip. No one moved. At a corner booth, a man in a black leather jacket sat motionless, his gray eyes cold as steel, watching everything and revealing nothing. No reaction, no movement, not a single word. The sheriff wearing the badge had grown accustomed to silence in this town, accustomed to fear, accustomed to people turning away. Authority and a borrowed shadow from powerful men had convinced him he was untouchable. That belief was a fatal mistake. The boundary he crossed belonged to Alexander Kensington, a man who ruled an empire from the East Coast, a man who understood that true power never needed to announce itself, and who knew precisely when to strike. Late autumn in western Colorado didn't arrive with romance. It came like a quiet warning that seeped into every crack of existence, into the thin mountain air, into the wooden frames of buildings that had forgotten their youth, into breath that turned white the instant it left the mouth. A pale sun hung behind low clouds like a witness too tired to testify. The highway cut through the foothills in long gray ribbons bordered by pine forests, and patches of early snow that looked more like ash than winter. The town was the kind travelers missed if they blinked. One main road, a few storefronts with faded paint, and a roadside diner perched on the edge of gravel and wind, its neon sign flickering in and out as if deciding whether existence was still worth the effort. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. If this story touches your heart, hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to 3 days earlier, when a black car rolled into this forgotten town and everything began to change. The black car rolled slowly along the main road of the town of Thornwood, its tires grinding softly over gravel mixed with the season's first snow. The engine was so quiet it was almost silent, with only a thin plume of white smoke drifting from the exhaust and dissolving into the biting cold air. Behind the wheel was Theodore Marchetti, 34 years old, his brown hair neatly trimmed, a short beard outlining his jaw, his sharp eyes constantly sweeping both sides of the road as though he were reading every smallest detail of this unfamiliar town. In the passenger seat, Alexander Kensington sat in silence, his back straight, his shoulders relaxed yet never slack with caution. He wore a black shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing solid forearms and a simple watch that made no effort to draw attention. A faint scar ran from his temple down to his left cheekbone, catching the weak light that slipped through the window, a remnant of a past he never explained to anyone. Alexander's gray eyes stared forward, cold and distant, yet missing nothing. A grocery store with a peeling sign, a barber shop long since closed, a police car parked at a slight angle by the curb, as if its owner did not care to straighten it. Alexander stored every detail in his memory without a word. Theo brought the car to a stop in front of a diner with a flickering neon sign that read, Maggie's Diner. The two men remained seated for a moment, watching through the glass. Inside, a few figures moved slowly. An elderly woman stood behind the counter. Several men in heavy coats sat near the window. Nothing seemed out of place. But Alexander had learned long ago that the most ordinary places often hid the darkest secrets. He gave a small nod, and they both stepped out of the car. Cold wind struck their faces at once, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Alexander tugged lightly at the collar of the black leather jacket he had put on before exiting, walking with an even pace, neither fast nor slow, every step radiating complete control. Theo followed closely behind, slightly to the right, a position that had become instinct after years of working together. The door chime rang as they pushed inside. Warm air from an aging heater rushed out to meet them, heavy with the smell of burnt coffee, frying grease, and something sweet that had been overcooked hours ago. Alexander paused for a single beat at the threshold, his gray eyes sweeping the entire room in less than 3 seconds. A long counter with cracked leather stools, 4 rows of booths lining the windows, a back door leading to the kitchen, an emergency exit in the left corner. 2 men in work jackets sat near the entrance, hands wrapped around coffee cups, eyes lowered as if they did not want anyone to notice they existed. An elderly woman with silver hair stood behind the counter, her back slightly bent, calloused hands polishing a glass, and a young woman carrying a tray, slender in build, dark brown hair tied back in haste, revealing a pale face and gray-blue eyes weighted with deep exhaustion. Alexander did not look at her for long. He walked straight to the booth in the far corner, where his back could rest against the wall and his eyes could watch every entrance and every movement inside. It was a habit formed during years when choosing the wrong seat could mean death. Theo sat opposite him, angling his body so he did not block Alexander's view. The young woman came to their table, holding a small notebook and a pen worn down with use. She did not meet their eyes, the habit of someone who had learned how to become invisible. Her voice was soft and slightly hoarse as she asked what they would like. Alexander glanced at her briefly, noting the bruise on her wrist that had faded to a dull yellow when her sleeve slipped back, noting the way she stood at a slight angle, as if accustomed to avoiding something, noting eyes that had once been beautiful and now held only fatigue. He ordered black coffee and toast, his voice low and even, not cold yet not friendly, simply neutral enough to leave no impression at all. Theo ordered the same. The young woman nodded, scribbled quickly, then turned away without another word. Alexander watched her disappear behind the counter, then shifted his gaze to Theo. Neither of them needed to speak. They had been in enough places like this to know that this small town was hiding something, and Alexander Kensington never left until he uncovered it all. Mia Collins carried the coffee and toast to the corner booth, setting them down gently without letting her hands shake, then turning away quickly, as if she were accustomed to becoming a ghost in her own life. 27 years old. Yet her shoulders bore the weight of someone who had lived through many lifetimes of pain. She had been awake since 4 a.m. to finish the overnight laundry shift at the shop at the end of the street, managing only 2 hours of restless sleep on the torn sofa in the staff room before the morning shift at Maggie's began. Her feet ached inside, sneakers worn thin at the soles. But she didn't have the money for a new pair, and she didn't have the time to think about luxuries like comfort. Every step she took was calculated to conserve energy, every movement shaped by the practicality of someone who had learned to survive on what little remained of herself. She stood behind the counter, rearranging clean cups, when the phone in her apron pocket vibrated. Mia glanced at the screen, and her heart tightened. St. Mary's Hospital. She asked Maggie for a minute and stepped into the back near the kitchen, where the noise of the dishwasher could hide the tremor in her voice. On the other end was the familiar voice of a nurse who had called many times over the past months, and every call had carried bad news. Her mother, Helen Collins, 54 years old, was in the final stage of lung cancer. Today she was weaker than yesterday. The hospital fees were 2 months overdue. If payment wasn't made this week, they would have to move her to a shared ward. Mia thanked the nurse in a voice so calm it surprised even herself, then ended the call. She stood there for a long moment, her back against the cold wall, eyes fixed on the water-stained ceiling. She didn't cry. Tears were a luxury she had given up long ago, since the night Tyler first punched her in the face and told her it was her fault. Tyler Morrison, the man she once believed was the love of her life, the man who had promised her a happy family when she was only 22 and too naive to recognize the warning signs. It began with small criticisms. She couldn't cook well enough. She didn't dress nicely enough. She wasn't smart enough to understand what he was saying. Then the criticism became slaps. The slaps became punches. The punches became nights when she curled up on the bathroom floor, covering her mouth so her little boy wouldn't hear his mother crying. Ethan, her son, 4 years old, blue eyes like hers, brown hair like his father's, a smile that could melt every pain she had ever endured. She had tried to leave. She had gathered all her courage to ask for a divorce, but she hadn't known Tyler had planned ahead. He quietly forced her to sign loan papers while she was still dazed from the beatings, used his wealthy family to hire the best lawyers in the region, fabricated testimonies claiming she was an unfit mother. In court, she stood alone in the only dress she had left intact, facing a team of lawyers in expensive suits. They said she didn't have stable work. They said she had mental issues. They said she couldn't provide a good environment for a child. No one asked about the bruises on her body. No one asked why she trembled whenever Tyler looked at her. The judge was a golfing friend of Tyler's father, but that wasn't considered a conflict of interest. In a small town where power passed from one generation to the next, like inherited property, she lost custody. She lost everything. Then Tyler disappeared, leaving behind a massive debt in her name, taking Ethan somewhere she wasn't allowed to know. It had been 14 months since the last time she held her son. 14 months since she breathed in the scent of children's shampoo from Ethan's soft hair. 14 months since she heard him call her mom. Mia pulled her worn wallet from her back pocket and opened it to look at the small photo creased from being touched too many times. Ethan was only 3 in the picture, grinning widely, both arms wrapped around the brown teddy bear she had bought him with a month of savings. She wondered if he still had that bear. She wondered if he still remembered his mother's face. She wondered if he knew that she thought of him every single second. that she worked herself to exhaustion every day with the hope that one day she'd have enough money to hire a lawyer, to fight for custody, to hold her son again. A single tear fell onto the photograph before Mia could stop it. She wiped it away quickly, tucked the wallet back into her pocket, drew a deep breath, and stepped out to the front of the diner with the smile she had practiced thousands of times in the mirror. The smile of someone who had learned to hide the hell inside so the outside world would never see it. The door chime rang again, and Mia lifted her head toward the entrance. Her heart warmed slightly when she recognized the familiar figure moving slowly across the threshold. Emma Collins, 17 years old, her younger sister, was making her way inside on a pair of wooden crutches worn smooth from years of use. Emma's left leg had been disabled since birth, a defect in the knee joint that had kept her from walking normally since the day she came into the world. Yet it had never managed to take the smile from her face. Emma's hair was a lighter shade of brown than Mia's, her eyes the same green as their mother's, and there was a strange brightness about her that life itself seemed unable to extinguish. She wore a gray sweater frayed at the elbows and loose jeans that concealed the bulky leg brace beneath. Mia hurried forward to help her, but Emma waved her off with that familiar smile. She hated being treated like someone fragile, even though her legs sent dull aches through her body whenever the weather shifted. The sisters sat at a small table near the kitchen, where Mia could talk while keeping an eye on the diner in case a customer needed her. Emma leaned her crutches against the wall, rubbed her left knee lightly, then looked at her sister with eyes long practiced at reading the truth in others. "Something's wrong, isn't it?" Emma asked, her voice gentle, yet unable to hide its worry. Mia hesitated for a moment, then told her about the call from the hospital. The overdue bills, the payment deadline, the risk of their mother being moved to a shared room. She tried to keep her tone calm, not wanting her sister to carry more fear. But Emma was sharp enough to understand everything without needing to hear it all. She was quiet for a moment, then reached out and took Mia's hand, her fingers small but warm, squeezing gently. "What about the surgery for my leg?" Mia asked, her voice tightening. The doctor had said that if Emma didn't have surgery before she turned 20, her knee would fully deform, and she would spend the rest of her life in a wheelchair. The operation cost more than $30,000. A number Mia couldn't reach, even if she worked herself to death. "I don't need the surgery," Emma said, her calm so steady it hurt to hear. "I'm used to this. These crutches are fine. You take care of Mom first." Mia looked at her sister, pain flaring in her chest. She knew Emma was lying. She knew how much pain Emma endured every night, knew how her sister relied on medication just to sleep, knew how the dream of walking like everyone else haunted her. But Emma never complained, never demanded anything. She had learned to sacrifice when she was far too young, learned to put others before herself, and that made Mia feel like a failed sister. "Everything's going to be okay," Emma said, her smile returning as if she truly believed it. "I'm graduating soon. I'll find a job. I'll help you. We'll get through this together, like we always do." Mia couldn't speak. She only tightened her grip on her sister's hand, swallowing back the tears threatening to rise. In the corner booth, Alexander Kensington lifted his coffee to his lips, his gray eyes drifting briefly toward the two sisters before turning away. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know their story, but he recognized at once the faint yet unyielding light in the eyes of the young girl leaning on crutches. It was the light of someone who refused to surrender to fate. It was the same light he had once seen in his own mother's eyes, many years ago, before that light was extinguished forever. The diner door flew open with such force that the bell shrieked like a cry for help. The air inside shifted instantly, as if someone had thrown open a window and let the cold rush in. Emma's body stiffened, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. Carlos and Miguel, the two laborers seated near the window, lowered their heads even further, their eyes fixed on their coffee cups as though they were the most fascinating things in the world. Behind the counter, Maggie dropped the glass she had been wiping, her hand trembling slightly as she picked it up. And Mia stood frozen in the middle of the diner, with a tray in her hands, her face draining of color as if she had just seen a ghost from her worst nightmares. Sheriff Wayne Briggs walked in like a man who owned the world. 48 years old, large and heavy, his swollen belly straining beneath a wrinkled police uniform. His cheeks were flushed from alcohol, tiny blood vessels etched across his skin like a map of long-earned decay. His eyes were small and shifty, the kind that never looked straight at anyone, always sliding over them as if assessing merchandise. His thinning hair clung damply to his scalp despite the cold, and uneven stubble framed a mouth perpetually drawn into a look of irritation. The gun at his hip hung angled forward, not for convenience, but because he wanted everyone to see it. He wanted them to remember who he was. He wanted them to be afraid. Briggs greeted no one. He didn't nod. He marched straight to the counter, his heavy steps making the old wooden floor creak, then dropped onto a stool as if it had belonged to him since the day it was made. "Coffee," he snapped, not bothering to look at Maggie. Then he turned to Mia with a gaze that made her want to disappear. "And you," he said, dragging out the words like a snake's hiss. "Bring it here, with your own hands." Mia swallowed hard and stepped forward to pour the coffee, her hands struggling not to shake. She set the cup down in front of Briggs and tried to turn away at once, but his rough hand closed around her wrist, tight, painful, right where the old bruises hadn't yet healed. Mia drew in a sharp breath but didn't cry out, didn't pull back, because she knew that would only make it worse. "Pretty," Briggs murmured, his thumb brushing over the delicate skin of her wrist. His voice lowered so only they could hear, yet loud enough for Emma to understand what was happening. "It's been a long time since I touched something this soft. You know how much I miss you. Every night I think about you, about the things I'm going to do to you." Nausea rose in Mia's throat. She wanted to scream. She wanted to smash the hot coffee into his face. She wanted to run, but she couldn't, because Emma was sitting there, staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. Because her mother lay in a hospital bed and the bills were overdue. Because Briggs had threatened to turn her life into hell if she ever opened her mouth, and he had the power to do it. "Please," Mia whispered, her voice shaking. "I need this job." Briggs chuckled, the sound like stones grinding together. He released her wrist, but not before dragging his hand slowly, crudely along her arm, as if marking territory. "This Sunday," he said, his tone returning to normal though his eyes did not. "You know where to come. Don't make me remind you again." Then he glanced toward Emma, a twisted smile spreading across his face. "Your little sister's looking pretty these days. Must be hard for her to get around. It'd be a shame if something happened that made it impossible for her to walk at all." It felt as if someone had punched Mia in the chest. She wanted to scream, to tear that hateful face apart, but her feet were nailed to the floor. All she could do was stand there, trembling, helpless, just like so many times before. In the corner booth, Alexander Kensington remained perfectly still. The coffee in his hand had gone cold long ago, but he hadn't touched it. His gray eyes stayed fixed on the scene, absorbing every detail, every word, every gesture. And inside him, something began to stir. A memory. He was 14 years old, standing outside his mother's bedroom, watching through a narrow crack in the door. His stepfather was there, a rough hand gripping his mother's wrist, his voice identical to that of the sheriff now, thick with ownership and threat. His mother, Catherine, the most beautiful woman he had ever known, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him, was trembling with her head bowed, afraid to look up, afraid to resist, afraid to cry out. And he, a thin 14-year-old boy, stood there powerless, not strong enough to protect her, not brave enough to do anything at all, until one night he heard her fall, the sound of her head striking the floor. Then silence. A silence that lasted forever. Alexander closed his eyes for a single second, his jaw tightening until muscles stood out beneath the skin. When he opened them again, his gaze was sharper, colder, more dangerous, like a blade freshly honed. He didn't look at Mia. He looked straight at Briggs, and in his mind, a decision had been made. Not now, but the time would come. Briggs drained the cup of coffee in a few large gulps, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, then stood up. But he didn't head for the door. Instead, his shifty gaze swept across the diner like a predator searching for its next target. And he found one. Carlos and Miguel were still seated at the table near the window, doing their best to shrink into themselves. Heads bowed low, eyes fixed on the tabletop. Carlos was 38 years old, his face darkened by sun and wind, his hands calloused from years of labor on farms. Miguel was younger, around 32, smaller in build but with hands just as rough. They were from Mexico, had lived in this town for nearly 5 years, doing the hardest jobs no one else wanted, earning miserable wages and never daring to complain. They had proper documents, green cards, the right to be here like anyone else. But that meant nothing to men like Briggs. "Hey," Briggs called out, moving slowly toward their table, each heavy step like a war drum counting down. "You two, let's see your papers." Carlos lifted his head, worry in his eyes though he tried to remain calm. "Sir, we have valid documents. We've lived here for years. You can check." His hands trembled as he pulled out his wallet and produced the green card, its edges worn from being carried too long. Briggs snatched the card away and glanced at it with contempt, as if it were a scrap of trash. He slowly turned it over in his fingers, his face twisting into a poisonous smile. "Fake," he said, though everyone knew it was a blatant lie. "You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know what kind you are? Coming here to leech off us, stealing American jobs, then daring to sit here drinking coffee like you belong." "Sir," Miguel spoke up, his voice small and shaking, "we have legal jobs. We pay taxes. We haven't done anything wrong." "Shut up," Briggs barked, his voice cracking through the room and making everyone flinch. "Did I say you could talk? Did I give you permission to open your mouth?" He stepped closer, looming over Miguel with his massive frame, alcohol-soaked breath flooding the smaller man's face. Carlos stood up, not to fight, only from an instinct to protect his friend. But that was a mistake. "You want something," Briggs snapped at Carlos, his eyes blazing. "You want to hit me? You want to resist an officer?" "Sir, I didn't mean that," Carlos said, raising both hands in surrender. "I just want to talk calmly." "Calmly?" Briggs laughed, the sound dry and vicious. "You dare tell me to be calm?" In a movement so fast no one could react, Briggs grabbed Carlos by the back of the neck and slammed his head down onto the table. The crash echoed through the sudden silence. Coffee spilled and ran along the edge of the table like a thin brown stream. Carlos lay face down, one cheek pressed into the puddle, not daring to move even as his forehead began to swell red. Miguel squeezed his eyes shut, tears sliding down his face, but he didn't make a sound. Briggs kept his hand pressed on Carlos's head and looked around the diner with a challenging stare. "Anyone want to say something?" he asked, his voice falsely sweet. "Anyone see me do anything wrong?" No one answered. Maggie stood behind the counter, both hands gripping the wooden edge until her knuckles turned white. Mia held Emma in the corner near the kitchen, one hand clamped over her sister's mouth to keep her from crying out. The remaining customers looked away, pretending they saw nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing, because that was how you survived in this town. In the far corner booth, Alexander Kensington remained completely still. His gray eyes didn't turn away. He looked straight at Briggs, straight at the way he forced an innocent man's head against the table, straight at the helplessness filling the room. His hand rested on the tabletop, utterly motionless, but Theo sitting across from him could see the knuckles had gone white from how tightly they were clenched. He was holding back, waiting, etching every detail into memory, because Alexander Kensington never acted until victory was certain. But when he did act, men like Briggs would learn a lesson they would never forget. If they lived long enough to remember it. Briggs finally released Carlos, tossed the green card into the puddle of coffee on the table, then walked out of the diner without looking back. The door slammed shut behind him, and the entire room seemed to exhale even though no one dared make a sound. Alexander placed a $20 bill on the table, twice the amount owed, then stood. He gave Theo a brief nod, and the two of them stepped outside in silence. The cold air outside cut like small blades against the skin. Briggs's patrol car was gone, leaving tire tracks in the wet gravel. Alexander stood beside their black car, his back resting against the body, eyes fixed on the town's main road as it sank into the fading afternoon light. Theo stood nearby, silent and waiting, because he knew Alexander would speak when he was ready. "This one," Alexander finally said, his voice low and steady like an engine idling. "He isn't just another corrupt sheriff." Theo nodded, pulling out his phone to check the message he'd received from an inside source. "That's right, boss. Wayne Briggs, 48 years old, sheriff of this county for 12 years. No one's dared run against him since the last candidate died in a very suspicious car accident. But that's not the most important part." Alexander turned to Theo, his gaze sharpening. "Go on." "Briggs is working with Frank Castellano," Theo said, lowering his voice even though no one was around. "He's a key link in the transport route Castellano's using to move goods through our territory. This small town is a transfer point. The shipments come up from the border, pass through here, then spread to major cities along the East Coast, and Briggs is paid to look the other way, even to provide police protection." Alexander stayed silent for a long moment, absorbing the information. Frank Castellano, 52 years old, boss of the Castellano family, one of the largest rivals to the Kensington Empire. The two sides had clashed in the shadows for years, but it had never escalated into open war because both understood the cost. But Castellano running a transport line through Alexander's territory without permission was a provocation that couldn't be ignored. What else? Alexander asked, his tone unchanged, though Theo could feel the danger building beneath the calm. There's a mole, Theo said heavily. Someone inside our organization has been feeding Castellano information. That's how he knows our patrol schedules, knows when to move shipments, knows how to avoid every checkpoint. We haven't identified who it is yet, but it has to be someone with access to high-level information. Alexander said nothing, but his jaw tightened until muscle stood out beneath the skin. Betrayal. It was the thing he hated most in this world, more than open enemies. Those who stabbed from behind the people who trusted them, those who sold loyalty for money or power. His father had died because of a traitor. He wouldn't let it happen again. We stay, Alexander said, the decision made. Cancel all other schedules. Tell everyone I'm handling a personal matter and won't be reachable for a few days. No one is to know where we are. Theo nodded without hesitation. And Briggs? He asked. Not yet, Alexander replied, his eyes drifting toward the diner where yellow light spilled through the fogged windows. I need to know how he connects to Castellano, who the middleman is, how the money moves, and most importantly, I need to know who the mole is. Killing Briggs now would be easy, but it wouldn't solve the root of the problem. Theo studied Alexander for a moment, then asked one more question. What about the girl in the diner? And her sister? Alexander didn't answer right away. He looked through the glass, where Mia was wiping up the spilled coffee on Carlos and Miguel's table, her thin shoulders trembling yet forcing themselves upright. He thought of his mother, of what she had endured, of what he hadn't been able to do. Keep an eye on them, Alexander finally said, his voice softening just a fraction, almost imperceptibly. If anything happens, let me know immediately. Then he opened the car door and got in, leaving Theo standing alone in the cold wind with a small smile on his face. After many years working with Alexander, this was the first time he had ever seen his boss take interest in someone who had nothing to do with business. Night settled over the town of Thornwood like a heavy black blanket, swallowing what little daylight remained. The temperature dropped even further, breath turning into thin white clouds that vanished into the frozen air. Mia left Maggie's diner at 9 in the evening after making sure Emma had safely boarded the last bus home. She pulled up the collar of her thin jacket, her worn sneakers moving quickly over the cracked sidewalk. Her next shift began at 10 at the Thornwood Inn on the far side of town, where she cleaned rooms and washed sheets until 2 in the morning. A 15-minute walk through the darkness wasn't something she liked, but she didn't have a car, and taxi money was a luxury that had no place in her tight budget. The street was deserted, filled only with the steady echo of her footsteps and the whistle of wind slipping through the gaps of old buildings. Mia passed the closed grocery store, the dark barber shop, the empty lot where weeds grew wild. She was thinking about her mother, about the hospital bills, about some way to find yet another job even though she barely had time to sleep, when headlights suddenly flared behind her, shining straight into her face. Mia turned, her heart beating faster. The police car rolled toward her, the engine growling softly like a hunting animal. She knew who it was before the door even opened. Briggs stepped out, his gait more unsteady than earlier that day, the stench of alcohol reaching her before he did. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, the look of a predator who had found a lone target. "Where you headed, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice drawn out and greasy. "Late night like this, a girl walking alone is dangerous." "I'm going to work," Mia said, forcing her voice to stay calm, though her heart was pounding wildly. "Thornwood Inn, night shift, you already know that." Briggs sneered and moved closer until Mia could smell his sour breath. "I know you're going to work. I know everything about you, Mia Collins. I know where you live. I know which school your sister goes to. I know which room your mother's in at the hospital. You think there's anything you can do that I don't know about?" Mia stepped back, but Briggs was faster. He grabbed her arm and yanked hard enough that she nearly fell. "Get in the car," he ordered, the joking tone gone. "I need to talk to you." "Please," Mia begged, her voice shaking. "I have to go to work. If I'm late, they'll fire me. Please." Briggs said nothing, only tightened his grip and dragged her toward the police car. Mia struggled, but her strength was nothing compared to his. She was shoved into the back seat and the door slammed shut. Briggs circled to the driver's seat and sat down, but he didn't start the engine. He turned and looked at her through the metal barrier, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You know what I want," he said, his voice low. "This Sunday, you're coming to my house. You'll do what I tell you, and you won't tell anyone. Understand?" "I can't," Mia whispered, tears finally spilling despite her effort to hold them back. "Please, I have a sister. I have a sick mother. I can't do that. Briggs laughed loudly, the sound filling the cramped car like a crow's cry. Oh, your sister. That crippled little thing. Right. She's grown into a pretty one. Must be hard for her to get around. Mia went rigid, fear turning into something colder and sharper. He was threatening Emma. You know, Briggs went on in a falsely sweet voice. Yesterday I got an anonymous tip that someone saw your sister buying drugs near her school. Of course it's nonsense, but who can say for sure? If I decide to investigate, if I decide to search her locker at school, and just happen to find a small bag of cocaine, what do you think will happen? She's only 17, but with a possession charge she'd be tried as an adult. And imagine a crippled girl in prison. No, Mia screamed, her voice breaking with despair. Please, my sister's done nothing wrong. She's innocent. Then you know what you need to do, Briggs said, the smile gone, replaced by cold cruelty. Sunday, 8 in the evening. Come alone, wear a dress, and remember, if you dare tell anyone, if you dare contact federal agents or anyone else, I won't just lock up your sister. I'll let your mother die in that hospital with no one to care for her, and I'll find your son, wherever he is. Understand? Mia couldn't speak. She only nodded, her body shaking uncontrollably. Satisfied, Briggs opened the door and shoved her out. Mia fell onto the cold pavement, her knees scraping through her thin pants. Now go to work, Briggs said from above, his voice full of contempt. Remember, I'm always watching you. The police car roared away, leaving Mia curled on the sidewalk, her tears dissolving into the darkness. 50 meters away, in the shadow of an alley, Alexander Kensington stood perfectly still. He had watched everything from beginning to end. He had heard every threat through the small listening device Theo had planted in Briggs's patrol car earlier that afternoon. His gray eyes were ice cold, but inside him a fire was burning. He watched Mia slowly push herself up, her legs trembling, then walk toward the hotel with the posture of someone who had been knocked down but refused to stay there. He wanted to step out. He wanted to tell her she wasn't alone. He wanted to promise he'd make Briggs pay for every tear she'd shed. But not yet. He needed more time, more evidence. He needed to be certain that when he moved, Briggs would have no chance to harm her or her family ever again. Just a few more days, he thought, watching Mia disappear into the night. Hold on for just a few more days. The next morning arrived for Mia like a nightmare that refused to end. She had barely slept after the night shift at the hotel, lying on the narrow bed in her shabby rented room, eyes wide open and fixed on the cracked ceiling, while Briggs's threats echoed in her mind like an endless ringing bell. Sunday, 3 days left. 3 days to choose between sacrificing herself or watching her sister be thrown into prison on fabricated charges. There was no real choice at all. She arrived at Maggie's diner at 6 in the morning with dark circles under her eyes and a heaviness in her steps. Maggie looked at her with concern but asked nothing, only slid a cup of hot coffee and a buttered piece of toast toward her, knowing Mia would never buy them for herself. Mia thanked her with a tired smile and began her shift as usual, clearing tables, wiping floors, pouring coffee, smiling at customers while inside she was breaking apart piece by piece. Alexander came into the diner close to 9, alone this time, without Theo. He wore a dark gray shirt beneath a black leather jacket, his hair slightly damp as if he had just showered, the scar on his cheek softened by the morning light yet still present as a reminder of a violent past. He chose the familiar corner booth with his back to the wall, ordered black coffee, and said nothing more. His gray eyes passed over Mia briefly, noting the shadows beneath her eyes, noting the slight limp in her step from her scraped knee the night before, noting the despair she tried to hide behind a strained smile. He said nothing, but he saw everything. Around 10, a group of 3 men entered the diner. They dressed like laborers, but the way they spoke and scanned the room made it clear they were not locals. They ordered a full breakfast, coffee, soft drinks, even dessert, laughing loudly as if they owned the place. Mia served them with professional courtesy, writing down everything they ordered and bringing each item promptly. But when she returned with the check, the table was empty. The 3 men had vanished through the back door, leaving behind dirty plates and a bill of more than $40 unpaid. Mia stood there for a moment, the check in her hand, feeling as if someone had punched her in the stomach. $40. That amount would be deducted from her wages under diner policy. That amount equaled nearly 4 hours of her work. That amount could buy Emma pain medication for a week. She bit her lip and swallowed her tears, about to turn and tell Maggie, when a hand reached out and stopped her. "How much?" Alexander asked, his voice low and even. No one knew when he had stood up. He had moved silently like a shadow, and now stood beside her, gray eyes fixed on the check in her hand. Mia stammered, not understanding what was happening. "No, sir. You don't need to. This is my fault. I should have paid more attention." "How much?" Alexander repeated, no longer a question but a command. Mia looked at him for a moment, then whispered, $42.60. Alexander pulled out his wallet, took out a $100 bill, and placed it in her hand. "Keep the change," he said, then returned to his table as if nothing unusual had occurred. Mia stood there holding the bill, unsure what to say. She had never met anyone like him, a complete stranger, with no connection to her, no obligation, yet willing to help without asking for anything in return. She walked to his table and set the extra money down. "I can't accept this," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you for helping, but I don't need charity." Alexander looked up, his gray eyes meeting her gray-blue ones. "It's not charity," he said, his tone gentler. "Consider it a tip. You deserve more than that for the work you do." They looked at each other in silence for a moment. Mia wanted to ask who he was, why he was here, why he cared. But before she could speak, the phone in her apron pocket vibrated. She apologized and turned away, hurrying toward the kitchen to answer it. Alexander watched her go, saw her back stiffen suddenly, saw her hand grip the wall for balance, saw her head bow as if struck by an invisible blow. When Mia returned, her face was white as paper. She didn't look at anyone, only went straight to Maggie and said something in a trembling voice. Maggie wrapped her in a hug, nodded, then gently guided her toward the back door. Mia disappeared into the staff room, and a few minutes later Alexander heard muffled sobbing drifting from that direction. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He already had someone monitoring the situation at the hospital since the night before. Her mother, Helen Collins, had worsened overnight. The tumor had spread to her liver. Emergency surgery was needed within 48 hours if there was to be any extension of time. The estimated cost was more than $80,000, a number Mia could never reach even if she sold everything she owned. Alexander sat there, the coffee cold in his hand, staring at the door through which Mia had vanished. He thought of his own mother, of her final days on the cold floor, of the helplessness of being unable to save the person he loved most. He couldn't change the past, but he could do something for the present. He took out his phone and called Theo. "Pay the hospital bills for the woman named Helen Collins at St. Mary's Hospital," he said without hesitation. "Do it anonymously. Leave no trace that can lead back to us. And arrange the best possible surgery for her." There was a second of silence on the other end. Then Theo replied, "Understood, boss. It'll be done within an hour." The surgery took place that night. Mia didn't know who had paid the hospital bills, didn't know who had arranged for her mother to be operated on by the best surgeon in the region. She only knew that when she arrived at the hospital after her night shift, a nurse told her that all expenses had been covered by an anonymous benefactor and that her mother was being prepared for surgery. Mia cried through the night, unsure whether the tears came from relief or fear, or the crushing sense of owing someone she didn't even know. She held her mother's hand before Helen was wheeled into the operating room and whispered that everything would be all right, that she would be there waiting, that they would get through it together. Helen Collins looked at her daughter with eyes dulled by illness and pain medication, smiled faintly, and said the last words Mia would carry for the rest of her life. "You are my greatest pride. Live well. Be happy. Never give up." The operation lasted 6 hours. The doctors did everything they could, but the cancer had spread too far, too deep, into places no blade could reach. Helen Collins passed away at 4:23 in the morning, in her sleep, without pain, like a candle that had burned through all its wax and slowly went out. Mia didn't cry when the doctor told her. She simply stood there in the empty hospital corridor, staring at the closed door of the recovery room, feeling as if all the air had been pulled from her lungs. Her mother was gone. The woman who had given birth to her, raised her, sacrificed everything for her, was no longer there, and she hadn't even had time to say goodbye. Emma arrived at the hospital in a taxi Mia had called, entering on her crutches with red, swollen eyes. The sisters held each other in silence, needing no words because there were none that could contain this pain. They sat by their mother's bed all morning, looking at a face that now seemed peaceful, free of the suffering and exhaustion they had grown used to in the final months. By noon, Mia told Emma to go home and rest. She needed to return to work because she couldn't take more time off, because funeral expenses were a staggering sum she had no idea how to cover, because life didn't allow her to stop even for a single day to mourn. She arrived at Maggie's diner at 2 in the afternoon, her eyes dry and burning, her face pale as paper, her steps heavy as if she carried the weight of the world. Maggie looked at her and understood immediately. She said nothing, only pulled Mia into a tight embrace and then let her start working, because she knew that sometimes work was the only thing that kept a person from collapsing. The diner was quieter than usual that day. Carlos and Miguel didn't come in, still shaken by what had happened the day before. There were only a few regulars and one man sitting in the familiar corner, gray eyes never leaving Mia, though she didn't notice him. Alexander had known since early morning. He had paid for the best surgery possible, but he couldn't buy a miracle. He watched Mia move through the diner like a ghost, pouring coffee with trembling hands, forcing a smile for customers even though her lips could barely curve upward, and he felt something strange tighten in his chest, something he hadn't felt in many years, pain on behalf of someone else. The diner door flew open and the air changed instantly. Briggs walked in, his face flushed from alcohol even though it was barely mid-afternoon, his steps unsteady, a smug grin on his lips. He scanned the room, his gaze locking onto Mia, and his smile widened. "Well, look who we have here," he said loudly, his voice carrying through the diner. "My little waitress. Heard your mom died, didn't she?" Mia froze, the coffee pot shaking in her hand. The diner fell silent. "Such a shame," Briggs went on, his falsely sweet tone laced with poison. "But when you think about it, it's probably for the best. Old woman lying there bleeding money dry. Now you don't have to worry anymore. And the money you save, you can use for something else. Like buying a nice dress for this coming Sunday. You remember, right?" Tears began to slide down Mia's cheeks, but she couldn't react, couldn't speak, could only stand there like a statue nailed to the floor. Maggie started to come out from behind the counter, but Briggs shot her a warning look, and she stopped short, her hands clenched until they turned white. "Don't cry now," Briggs sneered, stepping closer to Mia. "Your mom's dead. What do you need money for anymore? All you've got left is a crippled sister and a son you'll never get to see. Honestly, you don't have much left to lose, so relax and enjoy it." In the corner booth, Alexander remained seated, but his hand was crushing the glass coffee cup so hard his knuckles had gone white. He heard every word Briggs said. He saw every tear on Mia's face. He felt the contempt and cruelty dripping from the sheriff's voice, and inside him, something was roaring to be unleashed. Crack! The glass cup split in his hand, a long fracture running from rim to base. Alexander didn't look down, didn't react to the small cut in his palm as blood began to bead. He stared straight at Briggs's back, gray eyes cold as ice, with a fire burning behind them. Briggs eventually left after throwing out a few more vulgar remarks, leaving Mia standing in the middle of the diner with a tear-soaked face and a shattered heart. She ran into the back room, and her muffled sobs echoed like the cry of a wounded animal. Alexander stood, walked out of the diner without looking at anyone. Outside, he pulled out his phone and called Theo. "Pay all funeral expenses for Helen Collins," he said, his voice cold and hard as steel. "Anonymous. Best services available. And Theo," he paused for a beat, "get everything ready. I want everything on Briggs within 24 hours. Everything. Every dollar he's taken, every call he's made, every person he's met. It's time." Helen Collins's funeral took place the following afternoon at the small cemetery on the edge of town, where weather-worn headstones leaned in the cold wind like silent witnesses to countless lives already past. The service was simple yet dignified, with an oak coffin far finer than anything Mia could have afforded, pure white flowers covering the lid, and an elderly pastor reading prayers in a low, steady voice. Mia didn't know who had paid for all of it, who had transformed her mother's farewell from a poor and hurried goodbye into a ceremony worthy of a woman who had sacrificed her entire life for her children. She stood beside the grave, one hand gripping Emma's tightly, the other clutching her mother's photograph against her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks without a sound. Emma stood next to her on her crutches, her shoulders shaking in waves, the youthful optimism that usually defined her gone, replaced by a grief far too heavy for a 17-year-old. Only about 10 people attended. Maggie in an old black dress, her eyes red and swollen. Carlos and Miguel stood toward the back, hats in their hands, heads bowed in respect, even though they had never met Helen Collins. A few neighbors and regulars from the diner, and farther away, beneath the branches of an ancient oak about 50 meters off, Alexander Kensington stood alone, his black coat blending into the shadows, gray eyes fixed on the funeral without stepping closer. He didn't belong there. He had no right to share their grief. But he wanted to be there, to make sure at least that Helen Collins was laid to rest with dignity. The service ended as the coffin was lowered into the ground. Mia threw the first handful of earth, listening to the sound as it struck the wood like a funeral drum. She wanted to scream, to jump into the grave and hold her mother one last time, to beg God for just one more day to tell her mother that she loved her, that she was sorry she couldn't do more. But she stood in silence, because that was all she had left. People began to leave. Maggie hugged Mia and told her she didn't need to come to the diner that day, that she should rest, that she should take care of herself. Mia nodded, even though she knew she wouldn't be able to rest, wouldn't be able to sleep, wouldn't be able to do anything but lie awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about her mother. She was guiding Emma toward the cemetery gate when a familiar voice sounded behind her, freezing her in place as if struck by lightning. "My condolences, sweetheart." Briggs stood there, leaning against his patrol car parked just outside the gate, arms crossed, a predatory smile on his lips. He wore his uniform as if on duty, though everyone knew he wasn't there for work. "Your mom's gone," he said in a falsely gentle tone. "Such a shame. But life goes on, doesn't it? And you still owe me a date." Mia said nothing, only pulled Emma closer, as if her own body could shield her sister from the sheriff's leering gaze. "Sunday," Briggs said, his voice dropping, sharper and colder. 3 days left. I don't like waiting, and I don't like being told no. You'll be there on time, at the right place, alone. Otherwise," he glanced at Emma with a look that made the girl shrink inward, "your sister's going to learn what it feels like to be locked up with desperate criminals." Then he laughed, turned, got into his car, and drove away, leaving the two sisters standing in the cold wind, trembling for reasons far beyond the weather. That night, Mia couldn't sleep. She lay on her bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, thinking about her mother, about Ethan, about Emma, about the trap Briggs had set with no escape. She didn't know what to do. Going to Briggs meant losing the last shred of dignity she still had. Not going meant throwing Emma into hell. She was drowning in her thoughts when the doorbell rang, urgent and relentless. Mia sprang up, heart racing, and ran to open the door. Emma stood there, her face hollow with shock, hair loose and tangled, clothes smeared with dirt, one pant leg torn open to reveal a scraped, bleeding knee. Only one crutch remained, the other lost somewhere along the way. She was shaking like a leaf in a storm, tears streaming down her face. "Sister," Emma sobbed, her voice breaking with fear. "There were 2 men. They stopped me on the way home. They said they're friends of Sheriff Briggs. They said if you don't do what he wants, next time they won't just push me down." Mia pulled her sister inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it. She wrapped Emma in her arms, feeling her thin body shudder, feeling her tears soak into her shoulder. She wanted to scream that everything would be okay, that she would protect her, but she knew it would be a lie. She couldn't protect anyone. She couldn't even protect herself. The sisters sat on the cold floor, holding each other and crying. Crying for their mother who was gone, crying for a life filled with injustice, crying for a future with no way out. Outside the window, in the darkness of late night, a black car sat motionless at the corner of the street. Inside the car, Alexander Kensington remained perfectly still, gray eyes fixed on the small room where yellow light spilled through thin curtains. He had assigned someone to watch over Emma since the afternoon, but they had arrived one step too late, unable to stop the 2 thugs. He clenched the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. A mistake. He had allowed this to happen. He had waited too long. He couldn't wait anymore. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow everything would change. The next morning, Alexander left the small roadside motel where he and Theo had been staying since arriving in town, and drove to a quiet cafe on the outskirts, about 20 minutes from Thornwood. It was far enough that no one from town would notice, and secluded enough for a private conversation. Ryan Torres was already seated at a corner table when Alexander walked in, his youthful face tight with nerves, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee as if it were a lifeline. 26 years old and only 2 years into the job, Ryan still carried an innocence most officers in this town had long since lost. He was there because of an anonymous message Theo had sent the night before. A message saying someone wanted to talk about Sheriff Briggs and what was really happening in Thornwood. Ryan didn't know who the sender was, but he came anyway because deep down he knew his silence was turning him into an accomplice to the crimes he witnessed every day. Alexander sat across from him and didn't waste time. "I know who you are," he said, his voice low and steady. "Ryan Torres, 26, the lowest-ranking officer in the precinct. Your father was a cop too, died 5 years ago of a heart attack. You joined the force to follow in his footsteps, because you believed the law could protect the innocent. But since you put on that badge, you've seen only one thing. Briggs can do whatever he wants and no one dares stop him. Ryan swallowed hard, gripping his coffee tighter. Who are you? He asked, his voice barely steady. I'm someone who can end Briggs, Alexander replied. But I need evidence from the inside. What I've gathered from the outside might put him away for a few years, but I want him to never have a chance to come back. I need someone inside the department to give me the files that have been buried, the cases that were covered up, the dirty money trails. You're the only one there who still has a conscience. Ryan stared down for a long moment. You don't understand, he finally said. If I do this and get caught, Briggs will kill me. Not figuratively. He'll actually kill me and make it look like an accident, just like he did to the man who ran against him 7 years ago. I know, Alexander nodded. But you also know that if no one acts, Briggs will keep doing what he's doing. More women will be abused. More workers will be beaten. More families will be destroyed. Can you live with that? Ryan closed his eyes and thought of his father. Of the way he used to say the badge wasn't power but responsibility. That justice didn't arrive on its own. Someone had to stand up and demand it. He opened his eyes and looked straight at Alexander. I need to know who you are. Who you really are. Alexander considered for a second, then decided. If he wanted Ryan's full trust, he had to tell the truth. Alexander Kensington, he said. You may have heard the name. Ryan's face drained of color. You're the boss of the Kensington Empire on the East Coast. Why are you here? Because Briggs is working with my enemy to move contraband through my territory, and because I hate people who abuse power to crush the vulnerable. I'm not a good man, Ryan, but I have rules, and one of them is never forgiving people like Briggs. They looked at each other in silence. Finally, Ryan nodded. I'll do it. I'm on night shift tonight. I'll copy everything I can find. Files, emails, financial records. Briggs is careless. He doesn't think anyone would dare touch his computer. Alexander handed him a small USB drive. Put it all on this, and be careful. Don't let anyone see you. After Ryan left, Alexander drove to the farm where Carlos and Miguel worked. The two men looked at him with fear when he stepped out of the car, but Alexander raised both hands to show he was unarmed. I'm not here to cause trouble, he said in fluent Spanish. I'm here to talk about Briggs, and about how to bring him into the light. Carlos glanced at Miguel, then back at Alexander. We're just workers. We have no power here. But you have voices, Alexander replied. You can tell what you've seen, what Briggs has done to you and to others. If enough witnesses stand up at the same time, he can't silence everyone. And if we get deported, Miguel asked bitterly. We have valid papers, but here papers mean nothing if Briggs wants us gone. I'll protect you, Alexander said. I have resources. I have lawyers. I have people in many places. If you testify, I guarantee you won't be retaliated against. You'll have better jobs, in safer places. That's my promise. Carlos and Miguel looked at each other for a long moment, exchanging everything they didn't need to say aloud. Finally, Carlos nodded. We'll do it. For my daughter back home, because I don't want her growing up in a world where men like Briggs can do whatever they want. Alexander shook their hands, the roughness of years of labor pressing into his palm. You're brave, and you won't regret this decision. As he drove away from the farm, a message came in from Theo. Maggie Dawson has agreed to testify too. She kept photos and documents about her son's death, evidence that Briggs staged the scene. Alexander smiled for the first time since arriving in this town. The pieces were finally falling into place. Only one step remained. That afternoon, Mia returned to Maggie's diner, even though she wasn't scheduled to work. She needed to get out of the small room where every corner reminded her of her mother. Needed to do something so she wouldn't have to think about Sunday approaching like a death sentence. Maggie said nothing, only handed her an apron and wrapped her in a warm hug. The diner was quieter than usual, with only a few regulars and 2 men seated in the familiar corner. Alexander and Theo were speaking softly, heads inclined toward each other as if discussing something important. Mia brought them coffee as she always did, trying not to meet the gray eyes of the man whose presence strangely made her feel safe whenever he was nearby. She set the cups down and turned to leave when Theo's voice carried just enough for her to hear. Boss, Ryan sent the files. We have everything we need. Mia froze for a single beat, long enough to hear Alexander reply in that familiar low voice, now carrying an entirely different tone, the tone of command and authority. Good. Make sure everything is backed up. And get ready for this afternoon. Boss. She had heard it clearly. Not sir, not mister, but boss. Mia felt the blood in her veins turn cold. She hurried away, nearly tripping over a table leg, her heart racing wildly. That man wasn't a tourist. He wasn't a businessman passing through. He was someone important, someone dangerous, someone people called boss with respect and obedience. For the rest of the afternoon, Mia avoided the corner table like a disease. She let Maggie serve them and kept herself busy behind the counter. She could feel Alexander's eyes following her, but she didn't dare look back. She was too familiar with powerful men, and experience had taught her they always wanted something. No one helped without a reason. The diner closed at 9 in the evening. Mia stayed behind to clean because she didn't want to go home, didn't want to face the darkness and silence waiting for her there. Emma was staying at a friend's house, a safer place than their small rented room. Mia wiped tables, stacked chairs, swept the floor, doing everything slowly to stretch out the time. She didn't realize Alexander was still there until she turned and nearly dropped the bucket of water in her hands. "You're still here," she said, her voice higher than usual. "The diner's closed." "I know," Alexander replied, gray eyes fixed on her with something she couldn't read. "I want to talk to you." Mia stepped back, instinct flaring. "I don't know who you are. I don't want trouble." "I know what you heard this afternoon," Alexander said calmly, "and I know you're scared. You have every right to be. But I'm not here to hurt you." "Then why are you here?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "To end Briggs," Alexander replied, as simply as if he were talking about the weather, "and to make sure you and your sister are safe." Mia stood there, unsure whether to believe him. She was too used to being deceived, too used to empty promises, too used to hoping and being disappointed. But there was something in his eyes, a cold honesty, that kept her from turning away. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care about us?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, then he spoke. "Because my mother was once like you. She was abused for years by a powerful man. She had no one to help her, and she died because of it. I couldn't save my mother, but I can do something for you." Tears rose in Mia's eyes, impossible to hold back. She sat down on the nearest chair, her legs no longer strong enough to hold her. And then, without knowing why, she began to tell him everything. About Tyler, about the beatings, about the unjust court ruling, about Ethan, her 4-year-old son she hadn't seen for 14 months, about nights spent crying alone, missing the scent of her child's hair, missing his laughter, missing the feeling of holding him close, about her mother, about Emma, about a life of struggle she thought would never end. Alexander sat across from her, listening without interrupting, without judging, without pity. He simply listened, and sometimes that was all a person needed. When Mia finished, she felt as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been lifted. She looked at Alexander with red-rimmed eyes and asked softly, "Can you help me find my son?" Alexander studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll try." Sunday arrived like a sentence that had been handed down long ago. Mia woke before dawn, lying on her back, staring at the cracked ceiling of the small, cold room. Today was the day Briggs had issued his ultimatum. Today was the day she was supposed to choose between her dignity and her sister's safety. But last night, after the conversation with Alexander, something inside her had shifted. She didn't know who he truly was, didn't know whether he could really do what he promised, but for the first time in many years, she didn't feel completely alone. And that gave her the courage to make a decision she never thought she could make. She wouldn't go to Briggs's house. She wouldn't surrender, no matter what happened. Mia sat up, walked to the small table by the window, and began to write a letter for Emma. In it, she told her sister everything she had never said. How much she loved Emma, how proud she was of her strength, how, no matter what happened to her, Emma had to keep living, keep dreaming, keep fighting. She wrote down the address of the lawyer Alexander had given her, the one who would help Emma if she wasn't there anymore. She wrote about their mother's love, about Ethan, about her hope that one day Emma would find a happiness she herself had never known. By the time she finished, the pages were soaked with tears. She folded the letter, slipped it into an envelope, and hid it beneath Emma's pillow. Then she got dressed, stepped out of the house, and walked to Maggie's diner like any other ordinary day. Because no matter what happened, she still needed to work, still needed to earn money, still needed to keep living until she couldn't anymore. Sunday morning at Maggie's was quieter than usual. Only a few regulars sat scattered around, sipping coffee and reading the paper in silence. Carlos and Miguel weren't there because they had the day off from the farm. Maggie stood behind the counter, glancing at Mia with worry but saying nothing. She knew what day it was. The whole town knew, in the way small towns always know everything without anyone saying it out loud. And in the familiar corner, Alexander Kensington sat alone, his gray eyes never leaving Mia from the moment she walked in. He wore a black shirt and a black leather jacket, as if preparing for some kind of ritual. There was something different in the air today, a tension like a wire stretched so tight it was about to snap. Mia felt it but didn't understand why. The morning crawled by, slow as if dragging itself across the floor. Every time the doorbell rang, Mia flinched, her heart racing, thinking it was Briggs coming to claim her. But it was only ordinary customers, only familiar faces from the small town. Near noon, she began to hope that maybe Briggs had forgotten. Maybe he was drunk somewhere. Maybe she would be granted one more peaceful day. But hope was a luxury fate never let her keep for long. At 1 p.m, the diner door flew open. Mia didn't need to look to know who it was. The air in the room shifted instantly, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. Conversation died. Forks froze in midair. Everyone lowered their heads, like small animals sensing a predator approaching. Sheriff Wayne Briggs walked in, and he was drunk. His eyes were bloodshot, his steps unsteady, the stench of cheap whiskey pouring off him like a toxic cloud. His police uniform was rumpled, his badge hung crooked, his gun swayed at his hip with every step. He looked like a monster pulled straight from Mia's worst nightmare. "You!" Briggs roared, pointing straight at Mia. "It's time. Come with me. Now." Mia stood behind the counter, gripping the edge of the wood to steady herself. She looked at Briggs, at the cloudy eyes full of hunger and cruelty, and she knew that if she went with him today, she would never belong to herself again. She drew a deep breath and said the word she had never dared to say. "No." Briggs froze, as if he couldn't believe what he'd heard. "What did you say?" "I said no," Mia repeated, her voice shaking but her body unmoving. "I'm not going with you. I'm not doing what you want. You can do whatever you want to me, but I won't surrender." Briggs's face twisted with rage. He advanced toward her, each step like thunder drawing closer. "You dare refuse me? Who do you think you are? You're just a broke whore. Your mother just died, your sister's crippled, and you'll never see your kid again. What do you have to be proud of?" Every word was a knife plunging into Mia's chest, but she stayed where she was, not stepping back, not bowing her head, not begging. For the first time in her life, she refused to let fear control her. "You have no right to do what you're doing," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "You're a cop. You're supposed to protect people, not hurt them, and I won't let you hurt me or my sister anymore." A second of silence. Then Briggs swung his heavy hand with brutal force. The impact sent Mia reeling, her hip colliding violently with the wooden corner of the service area. The coffee cup in her hand fell and shattered on the floor, brown liquid spreading like blood. And from the corner of her mouth, real blood began to flow, bright red against her pale skin. No one moved. The diner seemed frozen in that instant, and in the far corner, Alexander Kensington sat utterly still, gray eyes cold as steel, fixed on what had just happened. No reaction, no movement, not a word. Not yet. Briggs grabbed Mia by the hair and yanked her upright like a cheap doll. Mia cried, not from the pain, but from the humiliation, the helplessness, the sickening familiarity of being treated as if she weren't human. He began dragging her toward the door, and no one in the diner dared to move. Maggie stood behind the counter, tears streaming down her aged cheeks, her lips trembling as if trying to form words that wouldn't come. The other customers lowered their heads, staring at their plates, as if they were the most fascinating things in the world. The silence weighed on the room like lead, and at that exact moment, the diner door flew open. Emma stood in the doorway, leaning on her crutches, her face pale with fear, but her eyes burning. She had read the letter Mia hid beneath her pillow and ran here the moment she understood what was happening. "Sister!" Emma screamed, her voice breaking with panic. "Let my sister go!" Briggs turned, a vicious smile spreading across his face when he saw the disabled young girl trembling in the doorway. "Oh, look who showed up," he said, his tone sweet with poison. "The cripple wants to play hero now." Emma didn't retreat. She dragged herself forward on her crutches, trying to reach her sister even as her body shook with fear. "You don't have the right to do this," she said, her voice high and clear like a bell. My sister didn't do anything wrong. Briggs released Mia's hair and turned to face Emma. He stepped right up to her, looming with his bulk, and shoved her hard. Emma fell to the floor, one crutch skidding away, her knee slamming into the cold tile with a sickening sound. She screamed, not from the physical pain, but from the humiliation of lying there helpless while her enemy stood over her laughing. And that was the moment Alexander Kensington stood up. He didn't rush, he didn't hurry. He rose slowly, every movement perfectly controlled, like a panther waking from sleep. The chair slid back without a sound. He stepped away from the table, each measured footfall echoing on the wooden floor like the heartbeat of a countdown. The air in the diner changed. It was hard to describe, like standing too close to a fire and feeling the heat before seeing the flames. People lifted their heads, survival instinct telling them something dangerous had just awakened. Even Briggs felt it. He turned and saw the man approaching, gray eyes cold as ice, and for the first time in many years, a flicker of unease crossed his face. Let her go. Alexander's voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of someone accustomed to commanding an empire. Each word fell like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward. Briggs tried to recover his confidence, forcing a sneer that didn't reach his eyes. Who the hell are you? Who do you think you are to interfere with my business? This is my town. I'm the law here. Alexander didn't stop. He kept walking, the distance between them shrinking, each step like the ticking of a bomb. Briggs drew his gun, his hand trembling slightly despite his effort to hide it, aiming straight at Alexander's chest. Stop, Briggs shouted, his voice pitched higher than usual, fear leaking through the cracks of his arrogance. I'll shoot! I swear I'll shoot! Alexander stopped less than a meter from the barrel, gray eyes locked on Briggs without a trace of fear. He'd faced death too many times to fear a gun in the hands of a drunk. Do you know who I am? Alexander asked calmly, as if making casual conversation about the weather. The question made Briggs hesitate. He frowned, searching his alcohol-blurred memory, trying to understand why the man before him was so confident with a gun pointed at his chest. Alexander Kensington, Alexander said, each word dropping like a stone marking a death sentence. And you've been moving contraband through my territory for 6 months without permission. The blood drained from Briggs's face. All that remained was the pallor of a man realizing he'd made the worst mistake of his life. Kensington. The name rang in his head like a funeral bell. Everyone on the East Coast knew that name. Everyone in the underworld knew what happened to those who crossed the Kensington Empire. He can't be here, Briggs stammered, the gun shaking violently in his hand. Castellano said he'd protect me. He promised. Alexander smiled, but the smile was colder than the ice outside the windows. Frank Castellano, he asked lightly. You mean Frank Castellano, who's being arrested by the FBI right now in Boston, along with the mole in my organization he bought off. Briggs's eyes went wide with horror. The world he thought he controlled was collapsing in front of him. The protection he trusted was gone. He was nothing more than a corrupt sheriff holding a gun while facing one of the most powerful men in America. And outside the diner, the sound of engines rose, followed by car doors slamming and heavy footsteps drawing closer. The diner door burst open, and what Briggs saw made the gun slip from his hand and hit the floor with a cold metallic clang. 4 FBI agents in black suits stepped inside, federal badges gleaming on their chests, hands resting on their holstered weapons in a ready stance. Leading them was a middle-aged woman with short salt and pepper hair, a sharp face devoid of emotion, eyes sweeping the room before settling on Briggs with carefully restrained contempt. Agent Catherine Wells, she said, her voice level as if reading from a report. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Wayne Briggs, you're under arrest on charges of corruption, abuse of power, sexual harassment, assault, and conspiracy in an interstate drug trafficking operation. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Briggs stood there like a man nailed in place, mouth hanging open, unable to believe what was happening. He tried to speak, to resist, but 2 agents moved in, turned him around, and cuffed him with swift professional motions. The metallic click of the cuffs locking echoed through the silence like a death knell. This is a mistake, Briggs finally found his voice, roaring like a cornered animal. You don't understand. I'm the sheriff. I've got connections. I've got protection. You can't do this to me. Agent Wells looked at him with icy calm. Frank Castellano can't protect you anymore, she said. He's being arrested in Boston as we speak, along with his entire operation. We have all the evidence we need. Financial transactions, recorded calls, shipping schedules, and most importantly, we have witnesses. As if to underline her words, the door opened again. Ryan Torres stepped inside, still in his police uniform, but his eyes now shone with something Mia had never seen before, the relief of someone who had finally done the right thing. He carried a thick case file holding hundreds of pages he had secretly copied during lonely night shifts at the station. "I'm ready to testify," Ryan said, his voice steadier than he expected, looking straight at Briggs without fear. "I've seen everything you've done over the past 2 years. I stayed silent for too long. Not anymore." "You," Briggs hissed, his face twisted with rage. "You're a traitor. I'll kill you. I swear I'll kill you." But his threats were nothing more than empty air now. He had no power left. His badge had been stripped away, his gun confiscated, and the people who once feared him were standing up, one by one, to tell their stories. Carlos and Miguel walked into the diner shoulder to shoulder. The laborers Briggs had treated like trash, now standing tall with dignity no one could take from them. They spoke of humiliation, beatings, threats of deportation, despite valid papers. Their voices trembled but didn't falter, because at last someone was listening. Maggie Dawson stepped out from behind the counter, holding an old box she had kept for 5 years. Inside were photographs, documents, evidence of her son's death. The 23-year-old Briggs had shot and disguised as an accident. She had kept them out of fear, loneliness, not knowing what else to do. Now she placed the box into Agent Wells's hands, her own hands shaking, and said, "This is my son. Please bring him justice." One by one, Briggs's victims stepped out of the shadows. Women he had harassed, shop owners he had extorted, families he had threatened. They came from all over town, like an underground river finally breaking its banks. Maggie's small diner couldn't hold them all, so they spilled into the street, standing in the cold wind, waiting their turn to speak, to be heard, to finally be believed. Mia sat on the diner floor with Emma in her arms, both of them staring at the scene as if watching a dream they couldn't believe was real. Briggs was led out to a car, hands cuffed behind his back, his face mottled with rage and fear. The crowd watched in silence. No cheers, no applause. Only the quiet of people finally freed from a fear that had lasted too long. Alexander stood in the corner, his back against the wall, observing everything without interference. His gray eyes met Mia's for a brief moment, and he gave a small nod, a gesture that said more than words ever could. Justice had arrived. Not loudly, not dramatically, but simply because the right people had finally stood up, and the wrong man had finally paid the price. Alexander's phone vibrated. A message from Theo. "Castellano's been arrested," the mole confessed. "It's over." He read the message, deleted it, and looked out the window as the FBI car carrying Briggs disappeared into the falling snow. Not yet, he thought. Not over yet. There was still a promise he needed to keep. The days that followed passed like a dream Mia didn't dare believe was real. The town of Thornwood seemed to draw a new breath, lighter and cleaner, no longer crushed beneath the shadow of a tyrant who had ruled it for more than a decade. People began speaking louder in cafes. Smiles appeared more often on the streets, and for the first time in many memories, they could walk past the police station without lowering their heads in fear. 3 days after Briggs was arrested, Mia received a call from a lawyer in Denver. His voice was professional, yet carried a hint of warmth as he delivered news she'd never dared to imagine. Tyler Morrison, her ex-husband, had been arrested in Arizona on charges of fraud, tax evasion, and document forgery. It turned out he'd left behind a long trail of victims and bad debts across 5 states, and the FBI had been tracking him for months before gathering enough evidence to move in. Mia didn't know that the reason the FBI had suddenly taken interest in a mid-level con artist like Tyler was because someone had sent them a detailed file outlining every crime he'd committed, along with evidence even he didn't know still existed. She didn't need to know. What mattered was that he'd been arrested, and that opened a door she thought had been sealed forever. The lawyer explained that, with Tyler's arrest and new evidence proving he'd falsified testimony during the custody trial, Mia had grounds to file an appeal. He told her an anonymous benefactor had prepaid all legal fees, and his firm would represent her free of charge. Mia cried for a full hour after that call, but these were different tears. Tears of hope, of joy, of a mother finally seeing a path leading back to her child. Ethan. Her son. Maybe she'd hold him again. A week later, Emma received notice from the hospital that her leg surgery had been scheduled. The entire cost of more than $30,000 covered by a medical charity she'd never heard of. She called everywhere trying to find out who had helped her, but no one knew, or no one said. Mia knew. She didn't tell Emma, but she knew. Only one person had the resources and the reason to do it. The man with steel-gray eyes and a heart far warmer than his exterior suggested. The surgery was successful. The doctor said Emma would need physical therapy for several months, but afterward she'd be able to walk normally, without crutches, without braces, for the first time in her life. When Emma woke and heard the news, she cried like a child, and Mia held her sister as they cried and laughed together, believing for the first time that maybe life wasn't entirely cruel. Maggie's diner came back to life as if infused with new breath. Customers crowded in like never before, not just for the food, but because this was the place where justice had won, where ordinary people had stood up to evil and prevailed. Maggie hired 2 more servers, fixed the flickering neon sign, and for the first time in years, she smiled more than she cried. She placed a photograph of her son on the counter beside a fresh flower changed daily, and whenever anyone asked, she told his story with pride instead of pain, because at last his name had been cleared. Carlos and Miguel no longer lowered their heads when they entered the diner. They sat by the window, speaking loudly and laughing like the free men they'd always been. Alexander kept his promise, arranging better jobs at a larger farm owned by one of the Kensington Empire's shell companies, with fair wages and fully legal work papers. They still came to Maggie's every morning, not because they needed a place to hide, but because it had become home. Ryan Torres was appointed interim county sheriff while awaiting the official election. He stood before the station in a new uniform, badge gleaming, and vowed to himself he'd become the man his father wanted him to be, a true guardian of justice, not a man who abused power. He began by reopening every case Briggs had handled, searching for wrongs to right and victims to compensate. It would take years to heal all the wounds Briggs left behind, but Ryan was ready to give his entire career to that work. And amid all those changes, Mia Collins stood behind the counter at Maggie's, pouring coffee with a smile she no longer had to force. She was still slender, still pale, still carrying invisible scars from the past, but there was something different in her eyes now. A small light, a belief that tomorrow might be better than today. And that was enough. That night the snow began to fall more heavily, laying a pure white blanket over the town of Thornwood, as if trying to erase every old wound. Alexander stood beside the black car parked in front of Maggie's diner, his leather jacket pulled high, his breath turning into thin, white mist that dissolved into the cold night air. Theo was already seated in the car, the engine humming softly as he waited. The work here was finished. It was time to leave. The diner door opened and Mia stepped outside. Her thin coat no match for the cold, but she didn't seem to care. She stood facing Alexander. Only a few steps between them, yet it felt like an entire world. "You're leaving without saying goodbye?" she asked, her voice light as the wind. Alexander looked at her, his gray eyes softening in the yellow glow spilling from the diner windows. "I'm not good at goodbyes," he replied. They stood there in silence for a moment, snow drifting gently around them like whispered confessions. At last Mia asked the question she'd been holding on to for a long time. "Why? Why did you do all this for me? For my family? You didn't owe us anything." Alexander was quiet for a long while. Then he spoke, his voice deeper, as if opening a door he'd kept locked for many years. "My mother's name was Catherine. She was beautiful, gentle, like you. She married my stepfather when I was 10, thinking he'd give us a family. But he was a devil wearing a man's skin. He beat her every night, and she endured it because she thought that was how she protected me." He paused, drawing a slow breath. "She died when I was 14. Fell down the stairs. That's what he told the police. But I knew the truth. I was there. I heard everything, and I couldn't do anything to save her." Tears streamed down Mia's cheeks, not from pity, but from understanding. She understood the pain of a powerless child. She understood the wound that never healed. "I can't change the past," Alexander continued. "But when I saw you, when I saw what Briggs was doing to you, I saw my mother, and I knew that this time I could do something. I had the strength to do what that 14-year-old boy couldn't." Mia stepped closer and placed her hand on Alexander's chest, where his heart was beating steadily. "Thank you," she said through a broken voice. "For everything. For my mother. For Emma. For Ethan. For giving me faith that there are still good people in this world." Alexander placed his hand over hers, squeezed gently for a second, then let go. "You'll be all right," he said. "You're stronger than you think. Live well. Be happy. For your mother. For your son. For yourself." Then he turned and walked toward the car. Mia stood there, one hand pressed to her chest, bowing her head slightly in a gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. Alexander looked at her one last time in the rearview mirror. Then the car rolled forward and disappeared into the white curtain of snow. 6 months later, summer arrived in Thornwood with warm sunlight and birdsong filling the town. Mia stood at Denver Airport, her heart pounding, her hands gripping a small sign with Ethan's name. She'd won the case. She'd regained custody. And today, after 14 months apart, she would hold her son again. The doors opened and a 5-year-old boy ran toward her, brown hair flying, blue eyes just like his mother's shining with joy. "Mom!" Ethan shouted, and Mia dropped to her knees and wrapped him in her arms, holding him tight as if afraid he'd vanish if she let go. She cried. Ethan cried, and they were the happiest tears she'd ever shed. Emma stood beside them. No crutches, no braces, her strong legs carrying her toward a future she once believed existed only in dreams. She smiled through tears and wrapped her arms around both her sister and her nephew. 3 weeks later, Mia received a postcard with no name, postmarked from New York. There was no return address, only a short handwritten line. "You did well." Mia smiled and placed the postcard in a drawer beside a photo of Ethan and the memory of a man with steel-gray eyes and a heart warmer than anyone she'd ever known. Sometimes we expect miracles to arrive with thunder and lightning, but this story reminds us that miracles often come quietly, not through violent force, but through patience. Not through revenge, but through justice. Alexander didn't win because he was stronger or richer. He won because he knew how to wait for the right moment, because he chose to do the right thing when no one was watching, and because he understood that true power never needs to announce itself. In our own lives, we may face similar moments, times when we feel powerless before injustice, times when we want to give up because everything feels too hard. But remember that kindness is never meaningless, courage is never wasted, and sometimes all it takes is one person standing up to change an entire community. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss meaningful stories each day. Share this video with those you love, because they might need a little hope in their lives. We'd love to know how this story affected you. Have you ever faced moments like this in your own life? Have you ever been helped by someone who asked for nothing in return? Leave a comment below and share what's in your heart. Every story matters, and we're grateful to listen. Thank you for staying with us until the final moment of today's video. We wish you and your family good health, joyful lives, and peaceful days ahead. Remember that no matter how hard life becomes, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.